Each Thursday, the millionaire ordered the same dish at Le Blanc restaurant. But this time, the young helper had seen something that made him risk everything to stop the first bite. Marcus's wet rag squeaked against the polished wood of table 7. He watched the drops of cleaning solution trickle down the curved table leg, just like they did every afternoon at Le Blanc restaurant. The dining room buzzed with the usual pre-dinner preparations, clinks of silverware, soft footsteps on carpet, and whispered instructions between servers. "Marcus, table 3 needs resetting," James, the floor manager, called out. His voice carried that edge it always had when speaking to the 12-year-old helper. "Yes, sir," Marcus responded, quickly wringing out his rag in the small bucket at his feet. The water was already turning gray. He'd need to change it soon. The evening sun slanted through LeBlanc's tall windows, casting long shadows across the cream-colored carpet. Marcus glanced at the ornate clock above the bar, 5:45 p.m. 15 minutes until Mr. Sterling's usual arrival. As if reading his thoughts, James approached again, straightening his black tie. "Sterling table needs to be perfect tonight. Thursday special. You know the drill." Marcus nodded, already moving toward the restaurant's best table, number 9, positioned perfectly between the windows and the decorative marble column. Mr. Sterling never sat anywhere else. "And Marcus," James added, his voice dropping lower, "stay out of their way tonight. Mrs. Sterling complained about you hovering last week." Heat crept up Marcus's neck. He hadn't been hovering. He'd just been curious about Mrs. Sterling's designer bag. It looked exactly like the one his mother had always wanted, back when she worked in the kitchen. The memory of his mother's time at Le Blanc made his chest tight. 6 months since she'd had to quit, since her arthritis got too bad for kitchen work. Now it was just Marcus, keeping their connection to Le Blanc alive through his after-school cleaning job. "Yes, sir," he mumbled, focusing on arranging the silverware just so, dinner fork 1 inch from the edge, knife blade facing the plate, everything measured and precise. The kitchen doors swung open with a soft whoosh. Marcus looked up to see Chef Andre directing the evening preparations, his white coat crisp and spotless. The smell of searing meat and aromatic herbs drifted into the dining room. "Marcus," Chef Andre's accented voice carried across the space. Come. Need help with prep?" Marcus hurried to the kitchen, carefully skirting the edge of the dining room where early customers were already being seated. In the kitchen, steam rose from massive pots, and line cooks moved in their practiced dance of preparation. "Wash these, quick," Chef Andre instructed, pointing to a crate of fresh herbs. "For Mr. Sterling's special. Must be perfect." Marcus plunged his hands into the sink, carefully washing each sprig of parsley. He knew Mr. Sterling's Thursday special by heart, herb-crusted lamb with wild mushroom risotto. The same dish, every Thursday, for the past 2 years. As he worked, Marcus heard the distinct click of heels on the kitchen's tile floor. He turned slightly, catching sight of Mrs. Sterling's blue designer suit as she swept past the kitchen entrance. That was strange. She never came this early, and never without Mr. Sterling. "Did you see that?" Marcus whispered to Louis, the dishwasher. Louis shrugged, barely looking up from his station. "Rich people do what they want, kid." But something felt off. Through the kitchen's round window, Marcus watched Mrs. Sterling's elegant figure move toward the storage area. Not the dining room, the storage area. She looked over her shoulder twice before disappearing around the corner. Marcus's hands stilled in the herb-washing water. In 2 years of working at Le Blanc, he'd never seen Mrs. Sterling go anywhere but the dining room or the ladies' room. "Earth to Marcus." Chef Andre's voice snapped him back. "Herbs, now." Marcus quickly finished washing the parsley, but his eyes kept drifting to the storage area door. Mrs. Sterling still hadn't emerged. The kitchen clock showed 5:55 p.m. Mr. Sterling would arrive in 5 minutes. He was never late. Marcus dried his hands on his apron, mind racing. "Chef, I need to get more cleaning solution," he said quickly, already backing toward the door. Chef Andre waved him off, focused on inspecting a rack of lamb. Marcus's shoes made no sound on the kitchen floor. He'd learned to walk quietly months ago, the better to avoid James's attention. He slipped past the prep stations, around the corner, and into the narrow hallway leading to storage. The storage area door was cracked open. Marcus pressed himself against the wall, inching closer. Mrs. Sterling's voice drifted out, low and intense. "Yes, everything's arranged. No, it has to be tonight. The policy is ironclad. I checked twice. Marcus held his breath. He shouldn't be here. He shouldn't be listening. But his feet wouldn't move. The special order is already being prepared. Yes, exactly like always. It'll look completely natural. A small clinking sound followed her words, glass against glass. Marcus risked a peek through the door crack. Mrs. Sterling stood with her back to him, one hand holding her phone to her ear. The other hand moved over something on the shelf, a small vial catching the light. By this time tomorrow, it'll all be done. Yes, the insurance company confirmed the payout. $5 million, tax-free. Marcus's heart pounded so hard he was sure she would hear it. His palms were sweaty, and his throat felt too tight. The kitchen doors banged open somewhere behind him. Mrs. Sterling, James's voice called out. Mr. Sterling has arrived. Marcus backpedaled quickly, nearly tripping over his own feet. He darted into the linen closet just as Mrs. Sterling emerged from storage, smoothing her hair with one hand, her other hand slipping something into her designer bag. Through the closet's slatted door, Marcus watched her walk past, her heels clicking purposefully on the floor. She paused at the kitchen entrance, and Marcus saw her face in profile, perfectly composed, red lips curved in a slight smile. "Andre, darling," she called to the chef, "make sure Charles' special is perfect tonight. It's a very important evening." Marcus waited until she was gone before sliding out of the closet. His hands were shaking. He looked toward the storage room, then at the kitchen where Chef Andre was already preparing Mr. Sterling's usual Thursday special. The dining room clock struck 6. Marcus heard Mr. Sterling's familiar laugh, followed by the soft murmur of James seating the couple at table 9. He had to do something. But who would believe a 12-year-old part-time cleaner over Mrs. Sterling? Who would even listen? Marcus walked back to the kitchen on unsteady legs. Through the round window, he could see Mr. and Mrs. Sterling seated at their usual table. Mrs. Sterling was smiling, touching her husband's hand across the white tablecloth. Her designer bag sat on the floor beside her, and Marcus knew what was hidden inside. Chef Andre's voice rang out, "Begin plating for table 9. Marcus gripped his cleaning rag tightly. He had less than 15 minutes to stop what was about to happen. The clock ticked. The kitchen hummed, and Marcus felt the weight of a life pressing down on his shoulders. Marcus's legs felt like lead as he watched Chef Andre begin Mr. Sterling's special. The kitchen's heat pressed against his face, but his hands were ice cold. "You okay, kid?" Looking kind of pale, Lewis said from his dishwashing station. Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it. The words stuck in his throat. How do you tell someone that you just heard a wife planning to murder her husband? "Hi. I need to tell you something," Marcus finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Make it quick. Got a sink full of plates here." Marcus leaned closer to Lewis, eyes darting around to make sure no one could hear. "I just saw Mrs. Sterling in the storage room. She was talking about insurance money and dash." "Marcus." James's sharp voice cut through the kitchen. "What did I tell you about hovering? Tables need clearing. Now." Lewis shrugged apologetically and turned back to his dishes. Marcus's chance slipped away like water down the drain. Through the kitchen window, he could see Mrs. Sterling laughing at something her husband said. Her hand rested casually on her bag, the bag with the vial. Marcus grabbed a bus tub and moved into the dining room, his mind racing. Maybe he could create a distraction? Spill something on Mr. Sterling? But James had already warned him twice about getting too close to the Sterling's table. "Young man," a voice called out. Marcus turned to find Mr. Sterling looking at him. "Could you bring us another napkin?" Marcus's heart jumped. This was his chance. He hurried to the service station, grabbed a crisp white napkin, and approached table 9. "Here you are, sir," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Sir, I need to tell you something about Dash." "Marcus." James materialized beside him. "I apologize, Mr. Sterling." The boys knew, still learning his place. "Not at all," Mr. Sterling smiled. "Eager young man. Reminds me of myself at that age." Mrs. Sterling's eyes locked onto Marcus. They were pale blue, like frozen water. "James, perhaps the boy needs more specific instruction about his duties." "Of course, Mrs. Sterling." "Marcus, kitchen. Now." Marcus had no choice but to retreat. Behind him, he heard Mrs. Sterling say softly, "The help these days, Charles." "Really?" The standards have fallen since they hired that woman's son. The kitchen doors swung shut behind him. Chef Andre was putting the finishing touches on the risotto, adding fresh herbs, the ones Marcus had washed earlier. In 15 minutes, the lamb would be ready. Marcus approached Lewis again. Please, you have to listen. Mrs. Sterling, she's going to dash, kid. I got my green card hearing next month. I can't get involved in rich people's drama. Lewis didn't even look up. Whatever you think you heard, forget it. Desperate, Marcus turned to Chef Andre. Chef, about Mr. Sterling's special dash. Ah, yes. Come. You can help garnish. Chef Andre beamed, completely misunderstanding. Big honor, helping with Sterling's special. Marcus watched helplessly as Chef Andre added the final touches to the risotto. The smell of herbs and mushrooms filled the air, along with something else. Something slightly bitter that Marcus couldn't identify. The storage room. He had to check the storage room. Bathroom, Marcus muttered, slipping away from the garnish station. He darted down the hallway, past the linen closet, to the storage room door. It was locked. Through the door, he could hear shelves being moved. Someone else was in there. Marcus pressed his ear against the wood. Everything's set. Mrs. Sterling's voice, followed by the sound of her heels. Marcus dove behind a stack of boxes just as she emerged. She walked briskly toward the kitchen, her hand brushing Chef Andre's arm as she passed. It smells divine, Andre. Charles will love it. Marcus crept to the storage room door again. This time, it opened. He slipped inside, flipping on the light. The storage room looked normal at first glance, shelves of ingredients, cleaning supplies, extra linens. But there, on the second shelf, something glinted. Marcus stretched on his tiptoes. A small empty vial lay on its side, partially hidden behind a box of napkins. No label, just glass and a few drops of clear liquid. Looking for something, Marcus spun around. Mrs. Sterling stood in the doorway, her designer bag clutched in one hand. Her face was calm, but her knuckles were white against the bag's leather. I was getting more cleaning solution, Marcus stammered. Really? The cleaning supplies are on the bottom shelf. Her voice was soft, almost gentle. I'd hate for your mother to lose another job because her son was caught somewhere he shouldn't be. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Marcus's throat closed up. I should go, he whispered. Yes, you should. Mrs. Sterling stepped aside, letting him pass. And Marcus? Children should be seen and not heard. Isn't that what they say? Marcus fled back to the kitchen. The lamb was almost ready. Chef Andre was plating the risotto, adding the garnish with careful precision. There you are. James grabbed Marcus's arm. Where have you been? Never mind. Take these waters to table 12. Marcus's hands shook as he picked up the water pitcher. Through the kitchen window, he could see Mr. Sterling checking his watch, his usual pre-dinner habit. The image of the empty vial flashed in Marcus's mind. What had been in it? What would it do to Mr. Sterling? The insurance policy Mrs. Sterling mentioned, $5 million if her husband died. Marcus had seen enough TV shows to know what that meant. But this wasn't TV. This was real. This was happening right in front of him. He looked around the kitchen desperately. Chef Andre, focused on the plating. Lewis, buried in dishes. The other kitchen staff, too busy with their own tasks to notice a 12-year-old boy's panic. The lamb was ready. Chef Andre began arranging it on the plate, next to the risotto. In 5 minutes, it would be served. In 10 minutes, Mr. Sterling would start eating. Marcus watched the plate coming together. The perfectly cooked lamb, the creamy risotto, the fresh herbs. Everything exactly as it always was, except for that slight bitter smell he'd noticed earlier. Mrs. Sterling's words echoed in his head. By this time tomorrow, it'll all be done. The clock on the kitchen wall showed 6:28 p.m. Mr. Sterling always started eating at 6:30. Marcus had 2 minutes to decide. Stay quiet and let it happen, or speak up and risk everything. His job, his mother's reputation. Maybe worse given the look in Mrs. Sterling's eyes. Through the window, he saw Mrs. Sterling raise her wine glass in a toast to her husband. The diamond on her finger caught the light, bright as the empty vial hidden in the storage room. Chef Andre lifted the finished plate. Service for table 9. Marcus's heart pounded against his ribs. 2 minutes. 2 minutes to choose between staying safe and doing right. 1 minute now. The plate was on its way to the dining room. 30 seconds. Marcus closed his eyes, thought of his mother, and made his choice. The morning sun hadn't reached LeBlanc's windows yet, but Marcus was already there, his hands submerged in soapy water as he cleaned breakfast dishes. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the empty vial and Mrs. Sterling's icy smile. Early today, Lewis commented, loading the dishwasher. You trying to earn extra points with James? Marcus shook his head, not trusting himself to speak. He'd arrived early for one reason, to watch Mrs. Sterling arrive. The kitchen door swung open at exactly 7:30 a.m. Mrs. Sterling's heels clicked against the tile floor, purposeful and steady. She wore a different blue suit today, but carried the same designer bag. Good morning, Andre. Her voice drifted into the kitchen. About tonight's special. Marcus inched closer to the kitchen door, straining to hear. As we discussed, Mrs. Sterling continued, Charles's meal needs to be perfect. Use the special seasoning I provided. All of it. Of course, madam, Chef Andre replied. As always, we aim to please. Marcus's stomach churned. The special seasoning. The vial. It was happening. Boy! James's voice made Marcus jump. Stop eavesdropping and get back to work. The morning crawled by. Marcus watched Mrs. Sterling move through the restaurant, checking details, speaking quietly with staff. She seemed to be everywhere at once, her presence filling every corner of LeBlanc. At noon, Marcus tried approaching Chef Andre again. Chef, about Mr. Sterling's dinner. He started. Ah yes. Big night. Chef Andre beamed. Special celebration, Mrs. Sterling says. Wedding anniversary, maybe? She brought special truffle seasoning, very expensive. Mr. Sterling will be so surprised. Marcus's words died in his throat. Of course Mrs. Sterling would have a cover story. Of course she'd make it seem normal. By 5 p.m., the kitchen was in full dinner preparation mode. Marcus watched Chef Andre unwrap the lamb, selecting the finest cuts for table 9. Mrs. Sterling says her husband's been feeling under the weather, one server whispered to another. That's why she brought that special immune-boosting seasoning. Another cover story. Marcus felt sick. At 5:45 p.m., exactly like yesterday, Mrs. Sterling appeared in the storage room. This time, Marcus was ready. He'd accidentally left his cleaning bucket nearby, giving him an excuse to be close. Everything's prepared, she spoke into her phone. The special seasoning is being added to his meal. By tomorrow morning, she paused, listening. Yes, it will look like natural causes. Heart failure, the doctor assured me. Completely untraceable. Marcus's blood ran cold. Heart failure. The words bounced around his head as he hurried back to the kitchen. I need to talk to someone, he whispered urgently to Lewis. Not now, kid, Lewis replied, gesturing at the pile of dishes. Dinner rush starting. Marcus looked around desperately. The servers were all busy with pre-dinner preparations. James was hovering near the dining room entrance. Chef Andre was focused on the lamb. The clock showed 5:55 p.m. 5 minutes until Mr. Sterling arrived. Marcus grabbed a serving tray and hurried into the dining room. Maybe he could warn Mr. Sterling directly. But table 9 was empty. Mr. Sterling wasn't there yet. Marcus, James called out. What are you doing with that tray? I thought I heard someone call for water, Marcus stammered. Get back to the kitchen. Now. In the kitchen, Chef Andre was adding the special seasoning to the risotto. The bitter smell was stronger now. Marcus watched in horror as the white powder dissolved into the creamy rice. He had to do something. Anything. Without thinking, he bumped into the prep table. Hard. A bowl of garnish toppled over, herbs scattering across the floor. Marcus! Chef Andre shouted. Clean this up, quick. But it wasn't enough. Chef Andre simply grabbed more herbs, the ones Marcus had washed yesterday. 6 p.m. The dining room door opened. Good evening, Mr. Sterling. James's voice carried into the kitchen. Your usual table is ready. Marcus peeked through the kitchen window. Mr. Sterling was settling into his chair at table 9, straightening his tie. Mrs. Sterling sat across from him, her designer bag placed carefully beside her chair. The usual Thursday special, James, Mr. Sterling smiled. Andre outdoes himself every time. In the kitchen, Chef Andre was plating the poisoned meal. The lamb, perfectly cooked. The risotto, creamy and deadly. The fresh herbs, hiding everything. Marcus watched the plate leave the kitchen, carried by James himself. Mrs. Sterling's eyes followed its progress, her red lips curved in a slight smile. The plate touched the table. Mr. Sterling picked up his fork. Marcus looked at the clock, looked at the plate, looked at Mrs. Sterling's smile. His mother's voice echoed in his head. Sometimes, Marcus, doing the right thing means doing the hard thing. The fork moved toward the risotto. Marcus burst through the kitchen doors. His feet carried him across the dining room, past shocked faces and dropped jaws. "Don't eat that," he shouted, pointing at Mr. Sterling's plate. "Your wife poisoned it." The dining room froze. Silverware clattered. Wine glasses trembled. Mr. Sterling's fork stopped halfway to his mouth, and Mrs. Sterling's smile disappeared. Time seemed to stop in LeBlanc's dining room. Marcus stood there, arm still pointing at Mr. Sterling's plate, his heart hammering against his ribs. Every eye in the restaurant was fixed on him. Mr. Sterling slowly lowered his fork. "What did you say, young man?" Marcus swallowed hard. His throat felt like sandpaper. "The food, it's poisoned. I heard Mrs. Sterling in the storage room. She put something in it." "That's ridiculous." Mrs. Sterling's voice cut through the silence. She stood up, smoothing her blue suit. "James, remove this boy immediately." "Wait." Mr. Sterling raised his hand, stopping James mid-step. "Let him speak." Marcus's words tumbled out in a rush. "Yesterday, I saw Mrs. Sterling in the storage room. She was talking on the phone about an insurance policy. $5 million. She had a vial of something. And today, she brought special seasoning for your food." Mrs. Sterling laughed, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Charles, surely you're not listening to this nonsense? He's just a cleaning boy." "The vial," Marcus continued, his voice stronger now. "It was small and clear. You hid it behind the napkins on the second shelf. I saw you put something from it into your bag." Mr. Sterling's face changed. Something flickered in his eyes. "A small glass vial?" he asked quietly. "About this big?" He held up his thumb and forefinger, showing the size. Marcus nodded eagerly. "Yes, and there was a bitter smell when Chef Andre added the special seasoning to the risotto." "Charles," Mrs. Sterling's voice had an edge to it now. "This is absurd. Are you really going to listen to a child's wild imagination?" But Mr. Sterling wasn't looking at his wife. He was looking at his plate, then at his wife's designer bag. "Victoria," he said slowly, "is this similar to the vial I found in your office last week? The one you said was expensive perfume?" The color drained from Mrs. Sterling's face. "James," Mr. Sterling's voice was calm but firm, "please call the police." "Don't you dare!" Mrs. Sterling snapped. She grabbed her bag, clutching it to her chest. "This is ridiculous. I'm leaving." She turned toward the exit, but two of LeBlanc's security guards were already there, blocking the way. Mr. Sterling must have signaled them somehow. "The bag, Victoria," Mr. Sterling said. "Put it on the table." "No." Mrs. Sterling backed away, looking around wildly. "You don't understand. I did this for us. The company is failing. We're going to lose everything." Mr. Sterling stood up slowly. "The company is fine, Victoria. In fact, we just landed the Peterson contract, which you would know if you'd been reading the reports instead of." He gestured at the plate, planning this. "The police are on their way," James announced, his phone in hand. Mrs. Sterling's composure cracked. She spun toward Marcus, her face twisted with fury. This is your fault. You little dash." She lunged at him. Marcus stumbled backward, but Mr. Sterling was faster. He caught his wife's arm, pulling her back. The designer bag slipped from her grasp. It hit the floor with a thud, and something inside shattered. A clear liquid began seeping through the blue leather. "Nobody touch that," Mr. Sterling ordered. He turned to the nearest server. "Get everyone out of the dining room. Now." The other diners were quickly escorted out. Soon, only Mr. Sterling, Mrs. Sterling, the security guards, James, and Marcus remained. "Sit down, Victoria," Mr. Sterling said quietly. Mrs. Sterling sank into her chair, all the fight going out of her. She stared at the growing puddle around her broken back. Sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer. "The boy," Mrs. Sterling said suddenly. "No one will believe him. It's his word against mine. And after what his mother did, what did my mother do?" Marcus demanded. Mr. Sterling looked confused. "Your mother?" Sarah Chen," Mrs. Sterling said. The kitchen worker who was fired for stealing. My mother didn't steal anything, Marcus shouted. She quit because of her arthritis. Mr. Sterling's expression darkened. Victoria, what did you do? Before she could answer, police officers burst through the restaurant's front doors, followed by men in hazmat suits. Clear the area, one officer ordered. Potential toxic substance. As the hazmat team approached the spilled liquid, Mrs. Sterling began to laugh. It was a hollow, empty sound. You know what's funny, Charles, she said. If the boy hadn't said anything, it would have looked natural. Heart failure, they said. No trace. No investigation. Just a grieving widow with a good insurance policy. The police moved forward with handcuffs. Wait, Mr. Sterling said. He turned to Marcus. How did you know? Why did you risk everything to warn me? Marcus looked at his shoes, then back at Mr. Sterling. Because it was right. And my mom always says doing the right thing is more important than doing the safe thing. Your mother sounds like a wise woman, Mr. Sterling said softly. I'd like to meet her. Charles, Mrs. Sterling called as the police led her away. Charles, please. We can fix this. But Mr. Sterling wasn't listening. He was staring at his plate, at the perfectly arranged food that would have been his last meal. James, he said finally, please get me a phone number for Sarah Chen. It seems I need to correct a grave injustice. The police swarmed the restaurant. The hazmat team carefully collected samples of the spilled liquid and the food. Officers took statements from everyone. Marcus sat in a corner, watching it all unfold. His hands had finally stopped shaking. James approached him, looking uncomfortable. Marcus, I'm sorry I didn't listen earlier. It's okay, Marcus said. And surprisingly, he meant it. Through the kitchen window, he could see Louis giving a statement to a police officer. Chef Andre was showing them where the special seasoning had been added to the food. Mr. Sterling walked over and sat down next to Marcus. Thank you, he said simply. I don't know many adults who would have had your courage. Marcus shrugged. I just didn't want you to die. No, Mr. Sterling smiled. You did much more than that. You chose to do what was right, even when everyone was against you. That's rare, Marcus. That's special. Outside, the police car carrying Mrs. Sterling pulled away, its lights flashing in the growing darkness. Inside, Marcus watched as hazmat teams cleaned Table 9, removing all traces of what almost happened. It was still Thursday, but it would be the last Thursday Mr. Sterling ordered the special at LeBlanc. It would be the last Thursday of a lot of things. The next morning, LeBlanc's kitchen felt different. The usual breakfast rush moved in slow motion as police officers continued their investigation, speaking with staff members one by one. Marcus sat at a small table in the corner, picking at a croissant Chef Andre had insisted he eat. He hadn't slept all night, replaying yesterday's events in his head. Marcus Chen. A tall detective approached his table, notebook in hand. I'm Detective Roberts. Mind if we talk? Marcus nodded, pushing aside the uneaten croissant. Can you walk me through everything again? Start from when you first noticed something was wrong. So Marcus told her everything. Mrs. Sterling in the storage room, the phone call about insurance, the vial, the threats. Detective Roberts wrote quickly, asking occasional questions. And you're certain about the words heart failure ? She asked. Yes. She said it would look natural. That's what the doctor told her. Detective Roberts' pen paused. What doctor? Before Marcus could answer, Mr. Sterling walked into the kitchen. He looked tired, his usual crisp appearance slightly rumpled. Detective, he nodded to Roberts. May I have a moment with Marcus? The detective closed her notebook. Of course. Marcus, we'll continue this later. Mr. Sterling took her vacant seat. For a moment, he just sat there, staring at his hands. I spoke with your mother this morning, he finally said. Marcus sat up straighter. Is she okay? She's fine. Better than fine, actually. She told me the truth about why she left LeBlanc. Mr. Sterling's jaw tightened. Victoria, Mrs. Sterling, she threatened to report your mother for theft unless she quit. Said she'd make sure your mother never worked in another restaurant in the city. But why? Marcus's voice cracked. Because your mother saw something she shouldn't have. A meeting between Victoria and someone in the storage room. A doctor, apparently. Mr. Sterling looked up. The same doctor who supplied the poison. From across the kitchen, Chef Andre called out, Police want to check storage room again. Mr. Sterling stood. Marcus, would you come with me? There's something I need to show you. They followed Detective Roberts to the storage room. The police had already gone through everything, but Mr. Sterling walked directly to a specific shelf. Here, he said, reaching behind some boxes. I found this last week. He pulled out a small notebook. The cover was blue leather, matching Mrs. Sterling's designer bags. I thought it was her diary, Mr. Sterling continued. I didn't read it. I respected her privacy. But now, Detective Roberts took the notebook, pulling on latex gloves before opening it. Inside were dates, times, and amounts. Payment records, she said. And a name. Dr. Harrison Mills, the restaurant's health inspector, Marcus blurted out. Everyone turned to look at him. I saw him with Mrs. Sterling sometimes. They would talk in the storage room. Detective Roberts spoke into her radio. Within minutes, more officers arrived. Mr. Sterling, one said, we found something in your wife's office at home. More notebooks. And vials. Mr. Sterling sank onto a box of napkins, the same shelf where Marcus had found the empty vial. How long? He whispered. How long was she planning this? Based on these records, Detective Roberts held up the blue notebook. At least 6 months. 6 months. Marcus thought back. That was when his mother had been forced to quit. Sir, James appeared in the doorway. The media is outside. They are asking for statements. Mr. Sterling straightened his tie, his business face sliding back into place. No statements. Not yet. And sir, the staff is asking questions. About continuing service. LeBlanc will close for a week, Mr. Sterling decided. Paid leave for all staff. We need time to. He gestured vaguely at the police activity. Deal with this. James nodded and hurried away. Marcus, Mr. Sterling turned back to him. Your mother agreed to meet with me this afternoon. Would you join us? Before Marcus could answer, Chef Andre burst into the storage room. They found something in the kitchen. In my special spice cabinet. Everyone rushed to the kitchen. Detective Roberts put on fresh gloves and carefully opened a small wooden box hidden behind the imported saffron. Inside were more vials, all empty. This wasn't the first attempt, Detective Roberts said quietly. Mr. Sterling gripped the counter. How many Thursday specials? The previous doses were too low, a new detective said, reading from a report. According to Mrs. Sterling's notes, she was gradually increasing the amount. Yesterday was meant to be the final dose. Marcus remembered all the Thursday specials he'd watched go out to Table 9. All those times Mrs. Sterling had brought her own special seasonings for her husband's meal. The kitchen fell silent except for the sound of police radios crackling. I could have died, Mr. Sterling said softly. I would have died, if not for. He looked at Marcus with red-rimmed eyes. Chef Andre suddenly slammed his hand on the counter. My kitchen. She used my kitchen for. He ripped off his chef's coat. I quit. I cannot cook here anymore. Andre, please. Mr. Sterling started. No. She made me part of this. I serve poison. Poison. Chef Andre's accent grew thicker with emotion. Louis stepped forward, still wearing his dishwashing gloves. We were all part of it, Chef. None of us saw what was happening. Except him. He nodded toward Marcus. One by one, the kitchen staff gathered around. Servers drifted in from the dining room. Even James joined the group. We failed you, Mr. Sterling, James said. We should have noticed. No. Mr. Sterling's voice was firm. Victoria fooled everyone. She fooled me, and I was married to her. The only person who saw through her plan was a 12-year-old boy who risked everything to save a stranger's life. Marcus felt his face grow hot as everyone looked at him. Which reminds me, Mr. Sterling continued. James, get me the paperwork for a college fund. And Andre, if you're willing to stay. I believe Marcus's mother might be interested in returning to LeBlanc. As our new sous chef. Chef Andre's eyes lit up. Sarah? She was my best worker. But her hands? Will have the best medical care I can provide, Mr. Sterling finished. Along with a significant settlement for the wrongful termination. The kitchen erupted in cheers. Louis hugged Marcus so hard he lifted him off the ground. Detective Roberts cleared her throat. We still have more questions. Of course, Mr. Sterling nodded. Marcus, shall we go meet your mother? I believe we all have a lot to discuss. As they left the kitchen, Marcus heard Chef Andre shouting orders. Clean everything. New spices. New equipment. When we reopen, everything must be perfect. Outside, reporters shouted questions. Camera flashes went off. But Mr. Sterling kept his hand on Marcus's shoulder, guiding him through the chaos. "Ready to help me rebuild LeBlanc?" Mr. Sterling asked as they reached his car. Marcus thought about his mother cooking again, about Chef Andre's kitchen, about doing the right thing even when it was hard. "Yes," he said. "I'm ready." The next day at LeBlanc felt surreal. Yellow police tape still crossed the dining room entrance, and officers moved in and out carrying evidence bags. The morning sun cast long shadows through the windows, making the crime scene markers glow like tiny red stars on the floor. Marcus watched from his usual corner as photographers documented everything. The table where it happened, the storage room, the kitchen. Each flash of their cameras made him flinch. "You look tired," Lewis said, sitting down next to him with 2 cups of hot chocolate. "Hey, Chef Andre made it special." Marcus took the cup, warming his hands around it. He hadn't meant to come in today. The restaurant was closed for investigation, but somehow his feet had carried him here anyway. "They arrested the doctor this morning," Lewis continued. "It's all over the news." Marcus nodded. He'd seen the headlines on his way in. "Prominent doctor arrested in murder plot." Below that, "Millionaire's wife and health inspector conspired in poisoning attempt." "Your mother's getting a lot of calls," Lewis said. "Reporter types wanting interviews." "She's not talking to them," Marcus replied. His mother had been clear about that. No interviews, no cameras, no reporters on their doorstep. The kitchen doors swung open. James walked in, looking more disheveled than Marcus had ever seen him. "Marcus," he called out. "Mr. Sterling wants to see you in his office." Marcus stood, leaving his hot chocolate behind. He'd never been to Mr. Sterling's office before. It was on the 2nd floor, in a part of the restaurant usually off-limits to staff. The office was smaller than he'd expected, with windows overlooking the dining room below. Mr. Sterling sat behind a large desk, surrounded by papers. "Ah, Marcus. Thank you for coming." He gestured to a chair. "Please, sit." Marcus sat, noticing a familiar blue notebook on the desk. "The police finished analyzing Victoria's records," Mr. Sterling said, tapping the notebook. "She'd been planning this for nearly a year. Dr. Mills provided the poison in small doses, disguised as imported seasonings. They were careful, patient." He looked up at Marcus. "They would have succeeded if not for you." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I couldn't let it happen. No false modesty, please." Mr. Sterling leaned forward. "You saw something wrong and you acted, despite the risks. That's remarkable at any age, but especially for someone so young." He pulled out an envelope. "Which is why I want to discuss your future." Marcus took the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a letter, printed on heavy paper with LeBlanc's letterhead. "It's a trust fund," Mr. Sterling explained. "For your education. Any school you want, when the time comes. And there's something else." He handed Marcus another document. "A contract for your mother. Full benefits, including comprehensive medical coverage for her arthritis treatments. And," he smiled, "a significant promotion." Marcus stared at the papers, his vision blurring slightly. "Why?" "Because doing the right thing should be rewarded," Mr. Sterling said simply. "And because I owe you my life." A commotion downstairs interrupted them. Through the office windows, Marcus saw several police officers hurrying through the dining room. "They found more evidence at Dr. Mills's office," James said from the doorway. "Records of other incidents." Mr. Sterling's face darkened. "Other attempts?" "No, sir. Other successes. Apparently, Mrs. Sterling and Dr. Mills had done this before. At other restaurants, in other cities. They'd perfected their method." Marcus felt cold despite the warm office. How many other Thursday specials had ended differently? How many other diners hadn't had someone watching, noticing, speaking up? "The media's going crazy," James continued. "They're calling it the restaurant poisoning ring. They want interviews, statements." "No statements," Mr. Sterling cut him off. "Not yet. First, we take care of our own." He turned back to Marcus. "Speaking of which, how is the staff handling all this?" "There." Marcus thought about the kitchen, about Lewis's hot chocolate and Chef Andre's worried face. "They are scared. They feel used." "Of course they do." Mr. Sterling stood, straightening his tie. "James, call everyone together. All staff, kitchen and dining room. It's time we talked about the future of Le Blanc. 10 minutes later, Marcus stood with the rest of the staff in the kitchen. Even the part-time cleaners were there, huddled together near the sink. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat. Yesterday, we discovered that this restaurant, our restaurant, was being used for something terrible. Some of you may feel betrayed, angry, afraid. Those feelings are valid. Chef Andre nodded vigorously, his usual energy subdued. But Le Blanc is more than one person's actions, Mr. Sterling continued. It's more than fancy meals and wealthy customers. It's people like Chef Andre, creating art in his kitchen. Like Louis, keeping everything running smoothly behind the scenes. Like James, maintaining standards even in chaos. He paused, looking around the room. And it's people like Marcus who remind us that integrity isn't about status or position. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard. The staff stirred, several people patting Marcus on the back. So yes, we're closed this week. Yes, there will be changes. But Le Blanc will reopen, stronger than before. Anyone who wants to leave will receive excellent references and 3 months severance pay. Anyone who stays will be part of building something new. A restaurant where excellence includes ethics, where quality means character. Chef Andre stepped forward. I stay. My kitchen. My responsibility to make it right again. Me too, Louis said. One by one, the staff spoke up, choosing to stay. Even James managed a small smile. Excellent, Mr. Sterling said. Now, our first order of business. Sarah Chen will be returning as our new executive sous chef, once her medical treatments are complete. I trust there are no objections. Chef Andre beamed. Finally, someone who knows how to properly prepare duck confit. The kitchen erupted in laughter, the first real laughter since yesterday's events. And Marcus, Mr. Sterling added, will continue his after-school work here, if he chooses. Though perhaps with some new responsibilities. Marcus felt warm inside, like he'd drunk all of Chef Andre's hot chocolate at once. I choose to stay, he said quietly. Then it's settled. Mr. Sterling clapped his hands. We have 1 week to renovate, reorganize, and reinvent. Let's make it count. As the staff dispersed, discussing plans and changes, Marcus looked around the kitchen. Yesterday, he'd seen poison and plots in every corner. Today, he saw possibility. Hey, kid, Louis called out. Your hot chocolate's getting cold. Marcus walked back to his corner, but it didn't feel like a corner anymore. It felt like his place, earned and chosen. The police tape still crossed the dining room entrance, and reporters still waited outside. But inside Le Blanc's kitchen, something new was beginning, and Marcus was part of it. Sunlight streamed through Le Blanc's newly cleaned windows, casting bright squares on the freshly polished floors. 1 week had passed since the incident, and the restaurant looked different. Felt different. Marcus stood in the kitchen doorway, watching the morning preparations. The old spice cabinet had been replaced with a gleaming new one, its glass doors allowing everyone to see inside. Every container was properly labeled, every ingredient traceable. First day back, Louis said, adjusting his new uniform. All the staff wore them now, part of Mr. Sterling's changes. You ready? Before Marcus could answer, the kitchen doors burst open. His mother walked in, wearing a crisp chef's coat with executive sous chef embroidered on the pocket. Mom! Marcus ran to hug her. I thought your first day wasn't until next week. Sarah Chen smiled, her eyes bright. The new treatments are working better than expected. And besides, she flexed her fingers, these hands have been idle too long. Chef Andre appeared, beaming. Sarah, finally, come. We have new menu to plan. Marcus watched his mother follow Chef Andre to the prep station, her movements already more fluid thanks to the treatments Mr. Sterling had arranged. The sight made his chest tight with happiness. Marcus. James's voice was different now, less sharp, more respectful. Mr. Sterling wants everyone in the dining room. The police are here with news. The entire staff gathered around table 9, no longer a crime scene, but still carrying the weight of what almost happened there. Detective Roberts stood at the head of the table, her notebook open. Dr. Mills confessed everything, she announced without preamble. The poison, the previous victims, all of it. He's agreed to testify against Mrs. Sterling in exchange for a reduced sentence. How many? Mr. Sterling asked quietly. How many others? 3 confirmed cases in other cities. All wealthy men, all with large insurance policies. All ruled natural causes. Until now, the room absorbed this information in heavy silence. Mrs. Sterling is still denying everything, Detective Roberts continued. But with Dr. Mills's testimony and the evidence we found, she turned to Marcus. Your statement was the key. Without your warning, we might never have uncovered any of this. Marcus felt everyone's eyes on him. He stared at his shoes. There's more, Detective Roberts said. We found records of other planned targets, other restaurants, other victims. This wasn't going to stop with Mr. Sterling. Chef Andre muttered something in French that made Sarah gasp and cover Marcus's ears. When is the trial? Mr. Sterling asked. Next month. We'll need Marcus to testify. The room erupted in protests. He's just a boy. Haven't you put him through enough? There must be another way. I'll do it, Marcus said, his voice cutting through the noise. I want to. Sarah stepped forward. Marcus, honey, you don't have to dash. Yes, I do. He looked at Detective Roberts. Those other people they were planning to hurt. I have to help stop them. Mr. Sterling placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. Are you sure? Marcus nodded. Just like you said, doing the right thing is important, even when it's hard. Speaking of doing the right thing, Detective Roberts pulled out an envelope. The insurance company wanted me to deliver this. She handed it to Mr. Sterling. He opened it, read quickly, and smiled. They're awarding Marcus a civilian commendation, he announced, and a reward for preventing insurance fraud. Louis whooped. Chef Andre started clapping. Soon the whole staff joined in. Marcus felt his face grow hot. I didn't do it for a reward, which is exactly why you deserve one, Sarah said, hugging him close. All right, everyone, James called out. We reopen in 2 hours. Let's get to work. As the staff dispersed, Detective Roberts pulled Marcus aside. There's something else you should know. When we searched Mrs. Sterling's home office, we found a file on your mother. She'd been watching Sarah for months, waiting for a chance to force her out. Why? Because your mother almost caught her and Dr. Mills during one of their meetings. Mrs. Sterling couldn't risk having someone that observant in the kitchen. Detective Roberts smiled slightly. Like mother, like son, I guess. A commotion at the front door interrupted them. Through the windows, Marcus could see reporters gathering. They got word of the reopening, James said, hurrying over. They want statements about Mrs. Sterling, about the investigation. No statements, Mr. Sterling said firmly. Today isn't about the past. It's about LeBlanc's future. Chef Andre emerged from the kitchen, carrying a covered dish. The smell was amazing. New special, he announced proudly. No more Thursday lamb. Instead, we have this. He lifted the cover with a flourish. On the plate was an elegant dish of seared scallops with herb-crusted vegetables. I call it the Marcus, Chef Andre said, because it is small but powerful. Yes? Marcus stared at the dish named after him, his vision blurring slightly. Perfect, Mr. Sterling declared. Put it on the permanent menu. Sarah squeezed Marcus's hand. Your father would be so proud of you, she whispered. Marcus squeezed back, remembering his father's words before he died. Always watch out for others, son. That's what makes a man. The front doors would open soon. Customers would return. Life at LeBlanc would go on. Different, but stronger. Detective Roberts gathered her things to leave. We'll be in touch about the trial, she said. And Marcus? What you did, it wasn't just brave. It was wise. Remember that. Marcus nodded, then headed to the kitchen. He had tables to prepare, just like always. But now when he looked at the dining room, he didn't see rich people and fancy food. He saw his mother smiling in her new chef's coat. He saw Chef Andre teaching her the new menu. He saw Louis humming as he loaded the dishwasher. He saw James directing the servers with a gentler voice. He saw family. The morning sun reached table 9, making the new tablecloth glow white and clean. No more Thursday specials. No more secrets. Just truth, justice, and a fresh start. And somewhere in the city jail, Victoria Sterling sat in her cell, her designer clothes replaced with prison orange, her plans unraveled by a 12-year-old boy who chose to speak up. Justice, Marcus decided, tasted better than any special ever could. Marcus sat outside the courthouse, pulling at his too-tight tie. The morning sun felt hot on his black suit, the same one he'd worn to his father's funeral 2 years ago. "Stop fidgeting," Sarah said, smoothing his collar. "You'll do fine." Inside the courtroom, Mrs. Sterling's trial was about to begin. Through the heavy wooden doors, Marcus could hear people settling into their seats. "You don't have to look at her," Detective Roberts said, joining them on the bench. "Just look at me or the judge while you testify." Marcus nodded. He hadn't seen Mrs. Sterling since that night at LeBlanc, and his stomach churned at the thought of facing her again. "Marcus," Mr. Sterling approached, his own suit immaculate as always. "Ready?" "No," Marcus admitted. "But I'll do it anyway." The courthouse doors opened. James was there, along with Louis, Chef Andre, and several other LeBlanc staff members. They filed in silently, filling the back rows. "The whole restaurant came," Sarah whispered. "They wanted to support you." A bailiff appeared. "Marcus Chen? They're ready for you." Inside the courtroom, Marcus walked past rows of people to the witness stand. He tried not to look at the defense table, but he couldn't help it. Mrs. Sterling sat there in an orange jumpsuit, her perfect makeup and designer clothes gone. She looked smaller somehow. "Please state your name for the record," the judge said. "Marcus Chen." "And how old are you?" "Marcus." 12. "Your Honor." The questioning began. The prosecutor led him through that night. The storage room, the phone call, the vial, the warning. Marcus answered clearly, just like he practiced with Detective Roberts. Then it was the defense attorney's turn. "Marcus," the lawyer said smoothly, "isn't it true that your mother was fired from LeBlanc for stealing?" Objection. The prosecutor stood. The witness's mother was cleared of all allegations. Sustained, the judge ruled. The defense attorney tried again. "Marcus, why were you in the storage room that day? Weren't you supposed to be cleaning tables?" "I heard Mrs. Sterling talking about killing her husband," Marcus said firmly. "I followed her because I knew something was wrong. And you, a 12-year-old dishwasher, took it upon yourself to interfere in adult matters." "I took it upon myself to stop someone from being murdered," Marcus corrected, his voice stronger than he felt. In the gallery, he heard Chef Andre mutter, "Bien dit." "Well said." The defense attorney changed tactics. "Marcus, you testified that you overheard Mrs. Sterling discussing an insurance policy. But you never actually saw her put anything in Mr. Sterling's food, did you?" "No. But I saw her with the vial. I heard her talk about heart failure and natural causes. I smelled something wrong in the risotto." "Smelled something wrong?" The lawyer raised an eyebrow. "Are you a toxicology expert now?" "No," Marcus said. "I'm just someone who didn't want to watch a murder happen." Mrs. Sterling shifted in her seat. For a moment, their eyes met. She looked away first. The questioning continued. Marcus described everything again. The special seasoning, the phone calls, the threats about his mother's job. Finally, the judge said, "You may step down." Marcus walked back to his seat on shaking legs. Sarah hugged him tight. "Dr. Mills, please take the stand," the bailiff called. The former health inspector looked nothing like Marcus remembered. His expensive suit was replaced by prison clothes, his confident smile gone. Dr. Mills testified for hours, describing the poison scheme in detail. How they practiced in other cities, perfecting the method. How they chose victims who ate regular meals at high-end restaurants. How Mrs. Sterling had suggested targeting her husband after his company's stock dropped. "She said it would be easy," Dr. Mills testified. "He always ordered the same thing every Thursday. We just had to be patient, build up the dosage slowly." In the gallery, Mr. Sterling's face was stone. The trial lasted 3 days. Marcus sat through it all, listening as the truth came out piece by piece. Other witnesses testified, police officers, forensics experts, even past restaurant employees from other cities who had noticed strange things but stayed quiet. On the final day, the jury took only 2 hours to reach a verdict. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. Mrs. Sterling didn't react. She stared straight ahead as the judge sentenced her to 20 years in prison. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. "Marcus, how does it feel to have saved a life?" "Mr. Sterling, will LeBlanc recover from this scandal?" "Mrs. Chen, what's it like having your name cleared?" James and Louis formed a protective circle around Marcus and Sarah, guiding them through the crowd to Mr. Sterling's waiting car. "Dinner at LeBlanc," Mr. Sterling announced once they were safely inside. "On me. We need to celebrate." The restaurant was closed to the public that night. But the lights were on and the kitchen was busy. Chef Andre had prepared a feast. To Justice, Mr. Sterling raised his glass. Around the table, the entire staff joined the toast. To Marcus, Chef Andre added, "Our little hero." Marcus blushed. "I'm not a hero. I just did what anyone should do." "But that's exactly what makes you a hero, mon ami," Chef Andre said. "You did what should be done, when others would not." Sarah wiped tears from her eyes. "Your father would be so proud." After dinner, Marcus helped Louis with the dishes. Some habits were hard to break, even though he didn't have to clean anymore. "You know what's funny?" Louis said, handing him a plate to dry. "A year ago, I was scared to speak up about anything. Afraid of losing my job, my green card. But you showed me that staying quiet can be more dangerous than speaking up." James appeared in the kitchen. "Mr. Sterling wants to see you in his office, Marcus." Upstairs, Mr. Sterling sat behind his desk, but he wasn't working. He was looking at a photograph. "This was taken the day I opened LeBlanc," he said, showing Marcus the picture. "Victoria was there, smiling, supporting me. Or so I thought." He sighed. "Sometimes the people closest to us are the biggest strangers." "I'm sorry," Marcus said quietly. "Don't be. If she had succeeded here, she would have moved on to other targets. You didn't just save my life, Marcus. You saved others too." Mr. Sterling opened his drawer and pulled out an envelope. "Which is why I want to discuss your future." The envelope contained college brochures. "I know it's early," Mr. Sterling said, "but it's never too soon to start planning. Any school you want, when the time comes. And a position here at LeBlanc whenever you want it." Marcus looked at the brochures, then at Mr. Sterling. "Thank you. For everything. The medical treatments for Mom, the job, this." "No, Marcus. Thank you. For reminding an old businessman that integrity isn't found in fancy suits or expensive meals. It's found in the courage to do what's right." Mr. Sterling smiled. "Now, I believe Chef Andre is planning a special dessert. Shall we?" As they walked back to the dining room, Marcus saw his mother laughing with Chef Andre in the kitchen. He saw Louis teaching a new dishwasher the proper way to stack plates. He saw James showing a server how to fold napkins, his voice patient and kind. LeBlanc was different now. Better. Sometimes the best new beginnings come from the hardest endings. 1 month after the trial, LeBlanc hummed with its usual dinner service energy. The evening sun painted the dining room gold, glinting off polished glasses and freshly pressed tablecloths. At table 9, a young couple celebrated their engagement, unaware of the history beneath their feet. Marcus moved through the restaurant with practiced ease, no longer the uncertain boy who cleaned tables. He wore a new uniform now, black pants, white shirt, and a name tag that read Junior Host. "Marcus," James called from the front desk, "your mother needs you in the kitchen." In the gleaming kitchen, Sarah stood at her station, directing line cooks with the confidence of someone born for the role. Her hands moved smoothly, thanks to the ongoing treatments, as she plated an order of the Marcus, still the restaurant's most popular dish. "Taste this," she said, holding out a spoon. "I'm thinking of adding something new to the sauce." Marcus tasted carefully. "More pepper. That's my boy." Sarah smiled. "Your father always said you had his palate." "Speaking of taste," Chef Andre interrupted, "Mr. Sterling's guest will be here soon. Very important customer." The kitchen burst into extra activity. Since the trial, LeBlanc had not only recovered but thrived. The story of a 12-year-old boy stopping a murder had turned the restaurant into a local legend. "Marcus," Louis called through the service window. "Someone here to see you." At the front desk stood Detective Roberts, out of her usual suit and wearing a simple black dress. "Look at you," she grinned. "Moving up in the world. Just helping out." Marcus shrugged. "Are you here for dinner?" "Actually, I'm here to share some news." She glanced around. "Is there somewhere we can talk?" James pointed them toward the small office near the coat check. Inside, Detective Roberts pulled out her notebook. "We finished investigating Dr. Mills's records," she said. "Found evidence of 2 more victims in other states. Cases are being reopened." Marcus sat heavily in the office chair. "More people died?" "Yes. But because of you, their families will finally get answers. And justice." She closed the notebook. "You started something bigger than you know, Marcus. Other restaurants are changing their security policies. Health inspectors are being monitored more closely. People are paying attention now. Through the office window, Marcus could see the dining room filling up. At one table, he spotted Mr. Sterling greeting an elderly man in an expensive suit. "That's the Health Department Commissioner," Detective Roberts said, following his gaze. "Here to discuss new safety regulations. Mr. Sterling's been leading the charge for reform." The door opened and Sarah poked her head in. "Sorry to interrupt, but Marcus, honey, could you help seat the Johnson party? James is swamped." Marcus stood, straightening his uniform. "Duty calls. One more thing," Detective Roberts said. She pulled out an envelope. The reward money from the insurance company. It was officially released today. Marcus stared at the envelope. "I still don't want it." "I know. That's why Mr. Sterling helped set up a foundation in your name. The money will fund food safety programs and training for restaurant workers, teaching people to speak up when they see something wrong." Warmth spread through Marcus's chest. Dad would have liked that. Back in the dining room, Marcus guided the Johnson family to their table, answering questions about the menu with easy confidence. As he worked, he caught glimpses of the life flowing around him. Louis training a new dishwasher, showing the same patience Marcus had once shown him. Chef Andre and Sarah working side by side, their movements synchronized like dancers. James greeting guests with genuine warmth, his old stern manner replaced by something kinder. Mr. Sterling deep in conversation with the commissioner, gesturing passionately as he spoke about industry changes. At table 9, the engaged couple was finishing their meal. The woman dabbed her eyes, touched by something her fiancé had said. They were making their own history now, unknowing and unafraid. "Marcus," Chef Andre called out, "come quick. Need your opinion on new dessert." In the kitchen, Chef Andre stood proudly beside a stunning chocolate creation. "I call it truth and justice. Dark chocolate for the bitter, white chocolate for the light." "Yes." Marcus tasted a small piece. The flavors balanced perfectly. Not too sweet, not too bitter. "Just right." "Perfect," he said. Sarah watched them from her station, her eyes bright. "You know," she said softly, "your father used to say that life gives us moments of choice. Little crossroads where we decide who we want to be." Marcus thought about that night 1 month ago, about the choice he'd made, standing in this kitchen, watching poison being plated like art. He also said, Sarah continued, that our choices show who we really are. Not our words, not our plans, our choices. Through the kitchen window, Marcus could see Detective Roberts leaving. She paused at the door and gave him a small salute. The dining room was full now, alive with conversation and clinking glasses. Music played softly from hidden speakers. Summer evening light painted everything golden. "Order up," Chef Andre called. "Table 9. Marcus watched the servers move through the room, carrying plates of hope and renewal. Each dish that left the kitchen was more than food now. It was a promise. A promise that doing right mattered. That speaking up mattered. That one person's choice could change everything. "Hey, kid," Louis called from his station. "Remember when you were too scared to talk to the customers?" Marcus laughed. "Remember when you were too scared to talk to James? Look at us now, eh?" Louis grinned. Sarah appeared with a fresh batch of herbs. Less chatting, more working. These tables won't serve themselves. But she was smiling as she said it, her hands moving smoothly through the familiar motions of preparation and creation. Marcus straightened his name tag and headed back to the dining room. He had tables to attend to, customers to greet, life lessons to remember. At the front desk, James was training a new hostess. "Watch Marcus," he told her. "He knows that service isn't just about food and tables. It's about trust." The hostess nodded, wide-eyed. "I heard he saved someone's life." "He did more than that," James said. "He saved all of us. Reminded us what matters." Marcus pretended not to hear as he passed them. He didn't feel like a hero. He was just a boy who'd made a choice, standing in a kitchen full of possibilities. The sun set outside LeBlanc's windows, painting the sky in colors of ending and beginning. Inside, life went on, changed but stronger, different but better. And at table 9, new stories were already being written, one meal at a time.